The question is as follows. To what extent can one event impact the outcome of World War II? Battles can be very minor and not impact that much of an overall war, but they can also be monumental. They can impact the morale and reputation of an army and change the direction of a war. The two events of World War II I will be talking about are monumental moments of the war. One event led to America entering the war, but also unfortunately caused major discrimination against Japanese Americans. The other event led to the defeat of the Nazis and was the first major defeat of the Germans in World War II. American citizens at the beginning of World War II were skeptical of the war. Of course, they wanted to help out their allies, but they were afraid of another European war like World War I. They were sending supplies to their allies, but most considered it a European war, and it should stay there. Americans were living peacefully, not wanting to get involved with the war. Meanwhile, Japan was one of the three driving forces of the Axis powers. They had taken over Korea and had invaded parts of China and other Asian territories. They were trying to expand as much as they could from their tiny island, and were looking to continue expanding west. Despite the fact that no action from America was being taken, the American naval base on Honolulu scared Japan. They thought that if they continued west, America would step in to stop it. This fear drove them to deciding on a preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
On December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by the Japanese military. With no intention of heading to war, America was generally unprepared for this attack. It was a shock to all Americans and a tragedy for everyone involved. By the end of the attack, America had lost 2,400 people, while only 64 Japanese people died. The day after this attack, President FDR spoke out with an iconic speech called the Infamy Speech. During this speech, he recounted what happened at Pearl Harbor and asked that Congress officially declare war on Japan, saying, "I ask that Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire." During his speech, FDR gave several examples of Japan's hostility while being unprovoked. Quote, "Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night, the Japanese attacked Wake Island. And this morning, the Japanese attacked Midway Island." After this speech and the attack, it was clear that Japan was a very hostile country. People grew a hatred for Japanese people, which was especially tough for Japanese Americans who faced discrimination. People would put signs on doors using slurs and telling Japanese people that they could not enter the building. President FDR passed Executive Order 9066, which forced families of any Japanese descent to move out of designated military zones. After this order was passed, Japanese Americans' bank accounts were stopped, which prevented many from leaving. They got trapped in the military zones. Detention camps were set up for those who were unable to make it out. In these camps, entire Japanese families were forced to live in poorly converted stables. After the detention camps, families were moved to long-term camps in the south. These camps were crowded, unsanitary, and unfinished. They relied on the incarcerated families to finish building the prisons. These camps continued and were legal until 1944, which meant people were living in these terrible conditions for at least 3 years. They were officially torn down after the end of the war in 1945. The incarcerated families were given $25 after being released and were shipped back to their pre-war address. However, Japanese Americans faced continued discrimination, and many were unable to find work. The United States didn't officially address this injustice until 1988, 43 years after the war ended. Stalingrad was a city in the former USSR. It was a city of great importance to the Soviets and the Germans. The symbolic significance is mostly due to the city being named after Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviets during World War II. It was this symbolic significance that motivated Germans to fight for it and Soviets to defend it. Giving up Stalingrad wouldn't be an entire defeat for the USSR, but it would be a major blow to morale. Germany was on a hot streak, taking land on all borders. They took over Poland in 1 month, Norway in 2, and the Low Countries and France in 6 weeks. After taking that land, Hitler looked toward the USSR. Germany succeeded in taking several Soviet territories, including Leningrad, named after the former leader of the USSR. After these victories, Germany got cocky and split into 2 groups. Group A would march south toward the oil reserves in Baku, while Group B marched east to overtake Stalingrad. Marching into Stalingrad, Germany was more prepared, having 80,000 more troops than the Soviets, but being outnumbered would not make the Soviets surrender. On August 23, 1942, Germany launched an airstrike on Stalingrad, which bombed the city and killed hundreds of civilians. In order to strengthen their numbers, underage Soviets and Soviet women were allowed to help. Women would often build reinforcements and could even lead groups or become snipers. With more people on their side, the USSR launched a counterattack, which was swiftly defeated by Germany's 66th Army. After the failed counterattack, the Soviets retreated into the city, which started a battle for control of each and every building in the city. Tired of his men retreating, Stalin made a "no steps back" order. This order would prevent more retreats, and deserters would be executed. During October 1942, Germany was in control of 90% of Stalingrad. Things were looking very bad for the Soviets, but they didn't surrender. During the cold, harsh Russian winters, the Soviets were more prepared than the Germans, and Germany halted their forces outside of Stalingrad. Being used to the winter, the Soviets were given a great advantage they wouldn't squander. Germany had a very weak front line, often having only 10 to 20 men guarding 6 to 10 mile stretches. Knowing this, the Soviets planned to attack the front lines off the sides of Stalingrad. They succeeded in breaking through and met in the middle. This surrounded the German forces inside of Stalingrad. All other German troops fell back when the Soviets pushed on. Despite the sudden change of advantage, the other German group in Baku did not retreat to help out, but instead kept trying to take control until they were forced to retreat in December. Hitler planned for the troops in Stalingrad to escape, but was convinced to leave them there by a military general. The plan was to supply the troops by flying overhead and dropping supplies. Shortly after conceiving this plan, the Soviets targeted German air bases and knocked them out. German forces in the city had no choice but to surrender, but Hitler wasn't ready for that to happen yet. Hitler's last attempt to prevent surrender was on January 13th. His only idea was to promote one of the troops in Stalingrad to the position of field marshal. His hope was that they would not want to be the first surrendered field marshal in German military history. While this plan worked momentarily, malnourishment and lack of supplies got to them, and on February 2nd, 1943, the German troops in Stalingrad surrendered. This was a huge blow to Nazi morale, because Stalingrad was the first major Nazi defeat. After the battle, Hitler ordered Germany in a state of total war, in which all resources from Germany would be supplied to the military. With the momentum from this great success for the Soviets, they continued to fight the Germans and forced them all the way back to Germany, where they were finally defeated at the end of World War II. The impact of one event on an overall war might not be immediately apparent. The Germans thought that they would take Stalingrad as easily as they took Poland and Norway, but they were faced with their first defeat. One event in a war could have a very small impact on the outcome, but it could also be an unexpected end, turning the tides like the Soviets did.